few days later, actually, what happened during the travail when the Lord gives me that word about the 2000? God starts speaking to me about historic well diggers. And I get an email and my phone rings and it's a friend of mine, and I said, bro, why are you calling me? I mean, I'm like real in the middle of the encounter, but I knew I had to answer the phone. I said, why are you calling me? He says, I just sent you an email. Did you get it? I said, no, I'm like travailing right now. He says, no. He says, I sent you an email. He says, it's a prophetic word from Maria Woodworth-Etter. And he says, it's got an addendum by Bob Jones. Open your email and read it. So I open my email. And Maria Woodworth-Etter, Mariah, some people say Maria, I say Mariah. It's this prophetic word. She says, Indianapolis is a large, beautiful, centralized city, a city that's easily accessible to the saints in the north, south, east, and west. It's actually called the Crossroads of America. When you drive in, it says, welcome to the Crossroads. And basically, she talks about this special endowment of power that rests on the city, and talks about global missions and the great end time harvest. And then Bob Jones, he basically says this. He says, there will be a divine brotherhood, a partner. Capped wells will come gushing up. Wells started in the past by Maria Woodworth-Etter, John G. Lakes, and DeVera Franke for an end-time work that will never decrease, but always increase. The key is, I started this message emphasizing the brotherhood. The prerequisite to obtaining inheritance is obtaining it together. You cannot lay hold of an inheritance that has been designed for the brotherhood if you have a wrong concept of who the brotherhood is. God wants to correct some of our foundational understanding so that we can actually enter into that stadium and receive it together. There will be a divine brotherhood, a partnership. That's when capped wells will come gushing up. Then he goes on, there will be a global grace, a divine grace, a saving grace, a miracle grace. And he talks about, he outlines all these different things. And then he comes to this, he says, I also saw 2 cans of beer. Now, Indianapolis is covered in breweries. That's like the hip, cool thing. Everybody wants to start a new brewery, craft beer. He says, but I saw 2 cans of beer. In the Bible, it means wells. From there, they continued, Numbers 21. From there, they continued on the beer, the well, where the Lord said to Moses, gather the people and I will give them water. Then Israel sang this song, spring up, O well, sing about it. About the well that the princes dug, the nobles of the people sank, the nobles with scepters and staffs. He goes on to say, one on the east side there, and one on the west side, 2 major things are represented, 2 old major wells, 2 witnesses, Maria Woodworth-Etter, William Branham. I saw a brewery, Alcatraz, a breakout, releasing the prisoners. That name is important and has kept the hardliners locked up, imprisoned against the anointing. What you have to understand at that time is my wife and I had just signed the lease on a warehouse that was vacant, and the Lord told us to start holding prayer meetings in the warehouse. Before we signed the lease on the warehouse, no one was interested in it until we signed the lease, and suddenly the owner was getting offers from a brewery to buy it. I said, well, why does this brewery want to buy this warehouse? He says, well, because you know this building contained the first brewery he said the first brewery in the Midwest after Prohibition. So God has us sign the lease to start a house of prayer in an old brewery, and I'm in this encounter, and Bob Jones is saying, watch the brewery. All right, I'm going somewhere with this, because some of you are going, well, I don't live in Indiana, this is a cool story, but what's this got to do with LA? I'm getting there. A little bit later, a couple that served alongside Lou for a very long time, the Halls, came to visit us in Indianapolis, and they walked through the warehouse, and they're praying over it and praying over it, prophesying over what God's going to do. And suddenly, Marion Hall, she says, well, JT, isn't Maria Woodworth-Etter, isn't she buried here in Indianapolis somewhere? And I said, I think so. I don't know where it is. And she says, well, can we go visit her grave? And I said, I think so. It's 10 o'clock at night. I don't know how we're going to find it, or, you know, if we can even get in. She says, oh, that's okay. Let's just ask the Holy Spirit to take us to it. So the Halls, they always travel. If you don't know them, they always travel with like their family plus 3 or 4 other families. Like it's always like a crew. So we travel, we're praying in the Spirit, and I called 2 people who I thought might know where Maria Woodworth-Etter's grave is, and they didn't answer the phone. It was too late. We traveled down the street. I just get this sense it might be this direction on this one street. We're traveling, and suddenly we see this large, massive graveyard. I said, well, we're doing good, there's a graveyard. So we pull into this graveyard, and Marion and all her kids get out, and we have like cell phone flashlights, and we're running through a graveyard at like 10:30, 10:45 at night in the pitch dark. There's no street lights in the graveyards. Only intercessors. But in a glorious way, somehow, by the Spirit, the Lord led us directly to her grave. So we're standing at Maria Woodworth-Etter. In case you don't know who she is, she was the forerunner to some of the greatest, I think she was one of the most powerful evangelists in modern church history. She was a power evangelist who preached the gospel with miracles, signs, and wonders. She would stand like with a hand up in a trance. They called her the trance evangelist, and she would declare the glories of God. People would leave their bodies and go to heaven or hell for days. And then they'd come back into their bodies crying out for salvation. It really happened.
That's wild.
She was a forerunner to Amy Semple McPherson and many other well-known evangelists. So we're standing there at the grave, we're asking God to do it again. And as we're asking, we didn't see it when it happened, but a fireball shoots through the sky. And the next morning, CNN says fireball shoots across Midwestern sky, is seen in 3 states, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Marion said she believed it was an angel shifting positions. Where am I going with this? 4 years later, during that time, our little contending group of prayer warriors, we would go and we prayed all over the Indianapolis area in spots where we knew that she did tent revivals. And we stood at the crossroads, Jeremiah 6:16, stand at the crossroads where the good way is, ask for the ancient paths. So we're asking God, do it again, give us the ancient paths. And what happens is, 4 years later, I get invited here to Los Angeles for a meeting, some Hollywood type meetings. They got canceled, I came anyway. I arrived here on November 5th, 2013, and that night Marion Hall said, will you speak here at mine? Will you speak to Iqbalo? So I speak here about the fact that a month earlier, a lady had done a stadium evangelism event with Reinhard Bonnke. 22,000 people were there at the event, and we're on the phone and we said, well, how many people got saved? She says, well, you know, we're a little bit disappointed. We should have mobilized better, but right at 2,000. Now, for 4 years, we have been doing evangelism events looking for the sign of 2,000. There is a day of grace coming to this nation where 2,000 will come into the kingdom in a moment, and from that day, you'll know the wells are open. So it's September, Rosh Hashanah, the wells open in Orlando, Florida, and I was a little bit confused because I said, God, we were looking for that sign in Indianapolis. I thought you said that there's a day of grace coming to this city. And he says, no, I said there's a day of grace coming to the nation. And the well opened in Florida, which means the wells are open all over the nation. So I'm like, okay, God, I'm trying to get this. I'm trying to understand this thing. And so I preached that message here in my auditorium. The wells of revival are open. And then we find out. I come back for 222 in 2014. I'm staying here on this campus, and I have this crazy dream that was kind of disturbing. And I woke up at 6 in the morning, and I just decided to drive. It was earlier than 6, but I decided to drive around Pasadena and pray into this dream. And I found myself at Jackie Robinson Field. The Lord began to encounter me at Jackie Robinson Field because my mom, who I said is in heaven, her name was Robin, and I looked at the home plate and it said Robinson. And so I took that, it just felt like God was speaking through that little token directly to me about inheritance. And then I looked at the bleachers at Jackie Robinson Park, and I for a brief moment, it was like the bleachers were filled with the cloud of witnesses. I had this heightened awareness of eternal realities, of things that had existed in generations past that were somehow pressing in on that moment. And next thing you know, I'm still driving, and I end up in the parking lot of the Rose Bowl at the corner of a street called Arroyo Seco. And that's when I remembered that there was a tent meeting in Pasadena called the Arroyo Seco Worldwide Camp Meeting in 1913, and that's when I began to suddenly remember that Maria Woodworth-Etter was at that meeting. That powerful signs and wonders and miracles began to break out right over there at Arroyo Seco here in Pasadena. And God, all of a sudden, I'm shaking under this encounter, and I'm looking around, and the Rose Bowl was under construction, and there was a fence. And on the fence, I wanted to show you the picture. I took a picture with my cell, but I couldn't find it tonight. But on the fence there was a sign, and it said, honoring the past, preparing for the future. I just felt the weight of heaven. God was saying, I'm bringing you in to the storyline of the past in order to position you for what's coming.
Amen. Come on.
There's something about inheritance. So I'm looking at this. I'm in this encounter. And so I go back and I look up the Worldwide Camp Meeting, and I find out that there was a man from Canada who had come down to attend the Worldwide Camp Meeting. And his name was Argue, A-H Argue. And Maria Woodworth-Etter in her book, Signs and Wonders, speaks about this man from Canada who came, who she met at the Worldwide Camp Meeting, who was impacted, who moved in power, and she invited him to travel with her from Pasadena to California, or to Chicago. For a few years, he traveled with her, and she left Pasadena, went to Chicago, and prophesied that the greatest revival the earth has ever seen was coming in 100 years. She prophesied that in Chicago. Lou and a young guy here named Jacob had read that prophecy, and what I did not know is that they had entered into, at least one of them, had entered into a 40-day fast called the Maria Woodworth-Etter fast to contend for that prophecy to come true. I arrived here from Indianapolis with a house of prayer on the street where Maria Woodworth-Etter is buried. I arrived here on November 5th, 2013. The last day of their 40-day Maria Woodworth-Etter fast was on November 5th, 2013. I mean, does anybody understand what I'm trying to say?
Whoa.
It means your prayers are actually effective. They're real. So somehow God brought me into this storyline because there was a people over here in Pasadena contending for that inheritance. Well, what happens is we find out that A.H. argued through a series, I think, of dreams. Like Marion Hall's daughter started having some dreams about this woman named Aunt Z. Turns out A.H. argued, who met Maria Woodworth-Etter here in Pasadena, is from Canada. Marion Hall is from Canada, and A.H. Argue is her uncle. A.H. Argue traveled with Maria Woodworth-Etter to Chicago. She preached there. I'm about to fall off the stage. She preached there. They left Chicago, and he came and dedicated Etter Tabernacle, her church in Indianapolis. He preached the dedication ceremony. So when the Halls came to Indianapolis and said, let's find her grave, and they had no knowledge about that, God allowed us to find her grave because they had an inheritance in what God began in A.H. Argue 100 years ago.
Wow. Whoa.
What this means, some of you moved, you're not natives to Pasadena, to Los Angeles, to California. Some of you had some kind of supernatural suddenly, some kind of call to this region, and you had no idea why. Or maybe you heard that Lou moved here and you thought, well, I want to come and serve. I want to be engaged with this community. There's a nice church in LA I want to be a part of. But you have no idea that God is actually remembering covenants and promises that he made to your forefathers, and you actually live here because 1,000 years ago, one of your ancestors, he made a promise to, and you are completing their work. God's a God of inheritance. I went on in this research to find out that there was a man named Daniel Berry from Indianapolis who had a family that was getting very sick. In 1873, he moved to California, Southern California, and purchased 4,000 acres of land and began to grow oranges on that land. And he named that land the Indiana Colony. And today, in old Pasadena, right downtown, there's a little market called Indiana Colony, because some hipsters or whoever it was who opened it researched Pasadena's history and found out that Pasadena was first called the Indiana Colony, founded by a man from Indianapolis, Indiana.
What?
I know this is too much. This is like... But here's what you have to understand. What the Lord began to reveal to me about inheritance is that people groups have an inheritance together in God. We have a redemptive calling and a gifting, a redemptive gifting and a calling from the Lord, and an inheritance from God that's uniquely for specific people groups. They have something an expression, a gifting to bring to the Lord. It says in Isaiah 60, God promises Israel, it says, foreigners will rebuild your walls, their kings and priests will minister to you. It says that they will bring the offering, Sheba will bring gold and incense. So there is gold, there's inheritance in the land that's been assigned to people groups. And God, in the fullness of times, is going to redeem fully the inheritance that he's placed within those people. But also, he's going to redeem the inheritance that's in the land given to those people groups. So that means that every prophetic promise for Indianapolis, if Pasadena was founded by a man from Indianapolis, then that means the seed that's in the ground of Indianapolis cannot fully come forth until the seed that's in the ground in Pasadena or Los Angeles fully comes forth. In fact, it can't fully come forth here without the seed, the water from Indiana, falling on the land here. I know this is like kind of crazy and heady. In the same way, there are people in other parts of the country who don't live in LA who kind of are sick of LA. They're like, I mean, you've heard the like judgment prophecies over LA, right? Oh man, that place is corrupting the world. I just wish that earthquake would come and they'd fall off in the ocean. I'm telling you the truth.
That's right.
But see, we've had that mentality not only about certain regions, but we've had that mentality about people groups. I'm so tired of these black folks whining about racial injustice. Oh my goodness, I wish they would just... But see, what the Lord is doing in this hour is saying to the church, do you understand? You cannot receive your inheritance unless you are willing to sow in the inheritance of others. Unless you're willing to understand that unless LA gets their inheritance, you don't get your inheritance. I have an inheritance in Los Angeles. You have an inheritance in Los Angeles. You have an inheritance in Indiana. I have an inheritance in Indiana. We have an inheritance in the household of the faith. Because it belongs to the Lord. There's so much I did not get to. But I want you to understand it's Black History Month. It's Black History Month.
Yes.
And tonight I just felt like You needed to understand that the African diaspora, those who endured the transatlantic slave trade. In 1 Peter 2, it talks about slaves. It talks about what they went through. Actually, 1 Peter 2:18, as I'm wrapping up here. God tells the slaves to submit themselves to masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but to those who are harsh. He says, for it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. Wait, God says it is commendable if someone bears under the pain of unjust suffering, for it is commendable to God. I want you to know that you have an inheritance in the black community. Regardless of who you are, what ethnicity you were born of Adam, you have an inheritance in the black community. The African American history is your history. It is not just for black people to celebrate Black History Month. You have to understand that the reason why God used the son of a slave is because he had a pedigree, he had a heritage of 400 years of slaves who had bared up under unjust suffering, and they earned a commendation from God. You see, you and I have not lived under the groanings. We've not shared in the sufferings. I'm talking about shared origins, shared language, shared inheritance, shared story, shared destiny. But you have to understand that God is actually bringing a great harvest, and he's saying you need one another because of part of the coming conflict that's coming on the earth. You got to understand you will become like Christ, which means you will share in the affliction of Christ. We are going to share in the afflictions of Christ as a mature church. Let me say that again. If I get one thing through to you tonight, together we are headed towards the maturity of the bride and the marriage of the Lamb. We are headed towards a great day where heaven and earth become one. But it's coming with great conflict. So even in the pain of the African experience, in the tragedy, in the trauma of the unjust realities that countless, possibly even billions of people endured. We have no idea, no way of numbering how many Africans endured these injustices. But in the midst of it, the Lord put a song. This is my story. He put a praise in our hearts. He caused our physical suffering to produce a groan that could break through powers and principalities and touch heaven. It's one thing for us to be in here and get really emotional and say, God,